The night it happened was quiet in the way powerful neighborhoods always are. No sirens, no shouting, no chaos, just trimmed hedges, long driveways, and homes built to disappear behind money. The DOJ official had just finished reviewing case files at the kitchen table, glasses still on, laptop open, when a motion sensor lights outside snapped on. At first, it barely registered. In his line of work, odd hours and late nights were normal. Attention came with the job. But the second the low rumble of an idling police cruiser crept through the walls, instinct took over. He looked at the clock. Just past 11:30 p.m., too late for coincidence. He stood slowly, deliberately, as if sudden movement itself might be interpreted as guilt. Through the front window, he saw the cruiser angled aggressively toward the driveway, headlights off but engine running. Another vehicle rolled up moments later. Then a third. No lights, no sirens, just presence. The kind meant to intimidate without announcing itself. That was the first red flag. If this were legitimate, protocol would be different. Warrants, notifications, paperwork. None of that was happening. The knock came hard and fast. 3 strikes, not the polite kind, but the authoritative kind. The kind designed to remind you that resistance would be futile. He didn't answer immediately. He didn't have to. He was on his own property. Instead, he reached for his phone and quietly began recording. Years in federal service had taught him one unbreakable rule: power hates records. He walked to the door and opened it halfway, chain still on. The officer in front stepped forward immediately, chest puffed, hand hovering near his holster. He was young, too young to be carrying that much confidence, and behind him stood 2 others, one scanning the interior, the other pretending not to. The lead officer didn't introduce himself, didn't explain why he was there. Instead, he asked a question that made the air go cold. "You live here alone?" That was when the official knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a fishing expedition. He calmly asked for the reason for the visit. The officer smirked and claimed there had been a noise complaint. That was laughable. The house was silent, the street empty. The official pointed this out. The officer shrugged. "That's what we're here to check." He asked again, this time more firmly, what specific noise, what time, which neighbor. The officer didn't answer. Instead, he took a step forward, forcing the chain to pull tight. That step changed everything. The official stated clearly and on record that he was a federal employee and requested the officers leave unless they had a warrant. The reaction was instant. The smirk disappeared. The lead officer's posture stiffened, not with fear, but with offense. "That's so," he said. "You people always say that." The word people hung in the air longer than it should have. The second officer laughed quietly. The third shifted his weight, suddenly uncomfortable. What followed wasn't chaos. It was procedure weaponized. The officer claimed he smelled alcohol, then marijuana, then said the official was being uncooperative. Each accusation stacked on the last, none grounded in fact, all designed to create justification after the fact. The official never raised his voice. He never moved suddenly. He asked for badge numbers. That's when the lead officer snapped. He ordered the official to remove the chain and step outside. The official refused. Within seconds, the situation escalated. The officer grabbed the door, forcing it wider until the chain strained. The official stated, again, calmly, that the interaction was being recorded. That was the mistake. The officer reached out and slapped the phone from his hand, sending it skidding across the floor. That single act turned a questionable visit into a felony. Backup arrived with lights this time. Neighbors began to wake. Curtains twitched. Phones came out. The narrative the officers wanted, quiet authority, no witnesses, collapsed instantly. The official was forced outside, hands behind his back, placed in cuffs on his own porch while an officer loudly announced he was being detained pending investigation. That investigation would not go the way they thought, because while they were busy asserting control, they missed one critical detail. The DOJ official wasn't just anyone. He specialized in civil rights violations by law enforcement. This wasn't abstract. This was his work, his life, his expertise. And every second of that interaction, every lie, every procedural failure, Every unlawful command was being burned into his memory with prosecutorial precision. By morning, internal affairs had been notified. By afternoon, bodycam footage had been secured. By nightfall, the story had reached federal ears far above the local department. And that was only the beginning. The morning after the arrest didn't begin with outrage. It began with silence. A calculated, institutional silence. The local department issued no statement. The arrest report, hastily typed and riddled with contradictions, was quietly uploaded and just as quietly edited twice within 3 hours. What had started as a noise complaint was now labeled suspicious activity. The alleged smell of marijuana disappeared entirely. The official's name was misspelled. His address was wrong. Sloppy work, born of panic. Inside the DOJ official's home, the damage was subtle but telling. A scuffed doorframe where the chain had been forced. A cracked tile where the phone had hit the floor. Coffee left untouched on the counter, cold by the time he returned from a night in a holding cell he should never have seen. He didn't sleep. He didn't need to. His mind was already assembling the case. By 8:17 a.m., he had requested preservation orders for all bodycam footage, dispatch logs, radio chatter, and supervisor communications tied to the incident. By 8:19, he had sent a single email, brief, unemotional, devastating, to the Civil Rights Division. Subject line: unlawful detention and home intrusion. Immediate review requested. No adjectives. No theatrics. Just facts. The department, meanwhile, believed it could still control the narrative. A public information officer drafted a statement suggesting the officers were responding to community concerns and that the individual detained had been uncooperative. It was released at 10:42 a.m. It lasted exactly 37 minutes before being deleted, but screenshots never forget. Neither do journalists. The first leak didn't come from the DOJ. It came from within the department itself. A patrol officer, not involved in the incident, but sick of watching the same names get protected, sent an anonymous tip to a local reporter. 3 words did the damage. Bodycam is bad. By noon, the reporter had confirmed the identity of the detained individual. By 1:30 p.m., national outlets were calling. By evening, the department's phones stopped ringing entirely. Not because interest had died, but because everyone was now calling federal oversight. The bodycam footage told a story the arrest report couldn't survive. It showed the officers arriving without lights or sirens. It showed no attempt to contact dispatch about a noise complaint prior to arrival. It showed the lead officer making the "you live here alone" comment, clear, audible, unmistakable. It showed the phone being knocked from the official's hand. It showed the cuffs going on before any legal basis had been articulated. It showed laughter. Laughter was the detail that sealed it. Internal Affairs launched an inquiry that same week, but it was already too late for damage control. The DOJ official formally recused himself from any involvement in the investigation. Not because he needed to, but because optics matter. The case was handed to an independent federal prosecutor with a mandate that was narrow and lethal. Determine whether civil rights had been violated under color of law. The answer came quickly. Within 10 days, the lead officer was placed on administrative leave. Within 14, his union issued a statement accusing outside forces of targeting law enforcement. Within 21, that statement was quietly walked back after the union's own legal counsel reviewed the footage. No one wanted their name attached to what was coming. The indictment dropped on a Tuesday. It charged the officer with deprivation of rights under color of law, falsification of records, and obstruction. Each count carried weight. Together, they carried prison time. The officer surrendered himself the following morning, expression blank, badge already stripped. Cameras caught him entering the courthouse through the same door he had dragged countless others through. The symmetry wasn't lost on anyone. At trial, the defense tried the usual strategies. They argued stress, split-second decisions, officer safety, but the prosecution didn't argue emotion. They argued sequence, timestamps, policy manuals, training records the officer had signed, initialed, and sworn to uphold. Every deviation was mapped. Every lie was paired with video. The jury didn't deliberate long. Guilty on all counts. Sentencing came weeks later. The judge, a former prosecutor herself, didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She spoke about trust, about the sanctity of the home, about how authority, once abused, corrodes everything beneath it. Then she imposed the sentence. 8 years in federal prison. No early release recommendation. No leniency. The officer stared straight ahead as the gavel fell. The department fired him before the ink dried. Civil suits followed. Settlements reached 7 figures. Policy reforms were announced. Training programs were rebranded. New slogans were printed. But none of that erased the footage or the fact that it took a DOJ official being targeted for the system to respond with speed and severity. The official never gave a victory speech. He never went on television to gloat. When asked for comment, he gave one sentence and one sentence only. The law worked this time because it was forced to, and that sentence traveled farther than any press release ever could. The aftermath didn't arrive with closure. It arrived with consequences, quiet ones, structural ones, the kind that don't make headlines but reshape careers and department from the inside out. Within weeks of the sentencing, 3 supervisors were reassigned. Not disciplined, not demoted, reassigned. That alone spoke volumes. In bureaucratic language, reassignment is an admission without confession. Someone had signed off on that patrol pattern. Someone had approved the report edits. Someone had ignored the first red flag long before the knock on the door ever happened. The DOJ official returned to work without ceremony. Same building, same badge access, same unremarkable routine. That was intentional. Power doesn't need spectacle. It needs consistency. Colleagues offered quiet nods, brief handshakes, a look that said we know. He didn't discuss the case unless required. He didn't need to. The record did the talking now. Behind closed doors, however, the ripples kept spreading. Federal consent decree discussions began with the city less than a month after sentencing. Not announced publicly, not acknowledged officially, but happening. Audits were ordered. Stop data was reviewed. Complaint patterns were cross-referenced with officer assignments. Names surfaced repeatedly. The fired officer hadn't been an anomaly. He'd been a symptom. One internal memo, later leaked, said it plainly. This incident exposed systemic tolerance of boundary-pushing behavior. Tolerance, not ignorance, not surprise. Tolerance is a choice. The officer's former partners started to distance themselves publicly, issuing statements about how no one could have predicted this. But privately, texts and emails told another story. Jokes made after shifts, complaints about feds, comments about neighborhoods and types. Nothing overt enough to indict, but enough to reveal mindset. Enough to show how abuse doesn't start with violence. It starts with language. The DOJ official reviewed those communications as part of a broader advisory role months later. He didn't react emotionally. He annotated. He categorized. He flagged patterns. That was his discipline, turning personal violation into institutional accountability. Revenge is loud. Reform is surgical. The city council held hearings that summer. Uniforms filled the chamber. So did community members who had never been heard before. Mothers, veterans, business owners, people with stories that had gone nowhere because the badge had always won. The footage from the night of the arrest played on a loop in the background, muted but unmistakable. Every witness spoke under its shadow. One council member asked a question that landed harder than any accusation. If this can happen to someone who knows the law inside and out, what happens to people who don't? No one answered immediately. The department chief eventually did. Carefully, too carefully, and everyone noticed. Policy changes were announced. Knock-and-talk procedures tightened. Supervisory approval requirements expanded. Bodycam penalties increased. All necessary, all overdue, none revolutionary. The real shift happened elsewhere, in recruitment, in training, in who was quietly encouraged to retire early. The former officer, now inmate, filed an appeal. It failed. He filed another. It failed faster. Prison stripped away the posture he'd worn so easily on the street. Inside, authority worked differently. Commands weren't suggestions. Smirks didn't intimidate. And records followed you everywhere. The irony wasn't poetic, it was procedural. Meanwhile, the DOJ official declined a book deal, declined speaking fees, declined a chance to turn trauma into branding. He had seen that path too many times. It diluted the point. This wasn't about him. It was about precedent. And precedent was set. Federal training materials began referencing the case, not by name, but by circumstance. Late-night residential contact without cause. Escalation following assertion of rights. Retaliatory detention. The language was clinical, but the message was unmistakable. This is how careers end. This is how sentences begin. Years later, when asked privately whether he believed justice had truly been served, the official paused. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He said this instead. Justice isn't a moment. It's maintenance. The house was quiet again that night. No cruisers. No knocks. Just the sound of wind through trees and a system that, for once, had been forced to look at itself in the light. Years passed, but the case never truly closed. It lingered the way landmark cases always do. Not as headlines, but as footnotes that quietly dictate behavior. Inside law schools, it became a hypothetical. Inside police academies, it became a warning. Inside city halls, it became an unspoken fear. What happens when the wrong house is knocked on? The DOJ, official aged visibly during those years, not from stress, but from clarity. Power had revealed itself in its rawest form that night. How casually it can be deployed, how violently it resists being questioned, and how fragile it becomes once exposed to daylight. He carried that understanding into every meeting, every memo, every closed-door briefing. He was no longer just enforcing law. He was stress-testing it. The department involved never fully recovered its reputation. Recruitment numbers dipped. Lawsuits multiplied. Officers transferred out quietly, citing family reasons and new opportunities. The culture shifted, but not because of slogans or training videos. It shifted because fear finally flowed in the opposite direction. Not fear of criminals, but fear of consequence. One evening, nearly 5 years after the arrest, the official returned home from work and noticed something unusual. A police cruiser drove past his house, slowed briefly, then continued on. No lights, no stop, no knock. Just a cruiser obeying the same unremarkable rules as everyone else. It was insignificant, and it meant everything. He stood on the porch for a long moment after sunset, hands in his pockets, listening to the ordinary sounds of an ordinary street. This was what constitutional rights were supposed to feel like. Boring, predictable, uneventful. Across the country, similar cases began surfacing. Not identical, but related. Officers caught on camera. Charges filed. Convictions secured. Defense attorneys began advising clients differently. Unions adjusted their strategies. The ground had shifted just enough to matter. The officer who went to prison became a cautionary tale inside federal facilities. Not because he was famous, but because his story was specific. He hadn't been chasing a suspect. He hadn't been responding to danger. He had chosen intimidation out of habit. And habit, it turned out, was not a defense. From time to time, the DOJ official was asked whether he regretted opening the door that night. Whether, knowing what would happen, he would do anything differently. His answer never changed. If I hadn't opened it, he said, someone else would have. And they might not have walked away. That was the truth most people missed. The story wasn't about a fired officer or a prison sentence. It was about probability, about how many times abuse goes unrecorded, about how often silence wins, about how rare it is for power to miscalculate so badly that it targets someone equipped to fight back. In the end, no monument was built, no law was named, no holiday declared, just a ripple, a permanent one, running through policies, procedures, and the quiet hesitation officers now felt before turning authority into harassment. And that hesitation saved people who would never know why. The house remains there. The porch light still comes on at night. And the door, when it opens now, opens without fear, Not because fear disappeared, but because it finally learned where it belonged.